Good evening. How is everybody? Awesome. Welcome to Up for Discussion. In a minute I will exit, and Professor Connie Chiang and our guests will come to the stage. Connie will be moderating tonight's discussion, and she will introduce our guests. I want to first remind you, as I'm sure you all know, that this session will be videotaped. We're not live streaming tonight, but it will be videoed and will be replayed. And I want to take a little time, just a minute or so, to give you some background on this event. When I arrived a year and a half ago, I began to speak, and I've spoken consistently since then, about a central aspect of our mission as a great educational institution. And that is to develop in all of you, our students, the ability and the disposition to engage in respectful, honest, and thoughtful discourse and debate about the hardest issues of our time. In my welcome to the first-year students, many of whom are here tonight, last August, I challenged you to be intellectually fearless, to engage those issues and those individuals with whom you disagree, and in particular, and most importantly, where you are uncomfortable or may even be offended. This is how we understand the issues better, how we refine our thinking, and how we learn to make our ideas clearly understood, and this is how we change the world. Now, this is hard work, no doubt about it. We don't do it well in society generally, and we certainly don't role model it well with our kind of cable TV society where we go to different corners. But I have to say I'm incredibly pleased and proud to see that this semester and last you have been doing this at Bowdoin. In informal settings, in formal settings, in big and small events across the campus, you've been engaged in some amazing discussions and debates, many of which I've been able to witness with one another about some really tough stuff. So well done. Now, that brings us to tonight. Last fall, I asked a group of faculty, staff, and students with very different political views to spend some time helping me think about how we could create events that expose us to very different views on important topics of the day, that demonstrate the skills of honest and thoughtful discourse and debate, and that inform us, and that, frankly, are some fun as well. And so that brings us to this evening. And this group is the group that developed the program that we have this evening. Nicholas Kristof and Jason Riley are two of the most respected and thoughtful observers of issues facing our society and our world today, although they come at them from very different perspectives. And they're here for a discussion with Professor Chiang and a Q&A session with you. And following this session, about 200 of you who have tickets will head to Thorne for a follow-up set of informal discussions and randomly selected tables of 8, and where you'll engage in some pre-planned questions, and then some group texting across the dining hall on some other questions. So those of you that have tickets for the Thorne event should head there immediately after we are done here. The topic for tonight's discussion, political correctness and free speech on college campuses, is one that you all chose last December in a poll that we did among students. I'd like to have us all take a moment to thank the group that actually put all this together for their work. Tess Chalalikal, Scott McEachran, Tim Foster, Jack Lucy, Holly Sherburne, Peter Slavinsky, Andy Rudalevich, Tony Sprague, and Rebka Tess Famaramam. Sorry, Tess. Rebka, sorry. I knew I was going to stumble. I also want to thank Sue Zuckert. This program is made possible through a fund that Sue and her late husband Don established. Don was class of '56 and a former chairman of the board of Bowden's Board of Trustees. Many of you know Connie well. Connie Chiang is our associate professor of history and environmental studies. She studies U.S. history, specialties in environmental history, American West, social history, and Asian American history, and she's the author of Shaping the Shoreline, Fisheries and Tourism in Monterey County, and has published articles in a number of journals, and I am deeply grateful to Connie for her willingness to be here tonight and to moderate this discussion. And so without further ado, Professor Connie Chiang and our guests this evening.
Thank you so much, President Rose. Thank you all for being here tonight. I know it is a cold and snowy evening. It's a crazy time of the semester. and I really appreciate that all of you have taken the time to come and engage and listen to this very important discussion. So I am deeply honored to be the moderator this evening. This conversation comes at a time when issues of political correctness and free speech are front and center for many of us, whether we encounter them here on campus or we watch them unfold on the larger national stage. Our guests tonight, Nicholas Kristof and Jason Riley, are two accomplished journalists who have been deeply engaged in these issues. I know they have much wisdom and many insights to share with us as we grapple with these issues at Bowdoin. So a quick note about tonight's format. I'll be posing questions to both Nicholas Kristof and Jason Riley for about 45 minutes. Then the final half hour of our time will be devoted to audience questions. Some microphone stands will be set up at the end of each of these aisles. So before I ask my last question of the evening, I'll sort of give you a heads up that the Q&A is forthcoming and ask those of you who want to ask questions to sort of get ready to line up at those microphone stands. So now on to introductions. And again, I'm very, very honored to introduce our guests this evening. Nicholas Kristof is a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the New York Times, where he has worked since 1984. He has served as a correspondent in Los Angeles, Hong Kong, Beijing, and Tokyo. He has covered presidential politics. He has shed light on many important issues involving human rights, women's rights, health, and global affairs. He and his wife, Cheryl Wu Dunn, have authored many books. Most recently, A Path Appears, Transforming Lives, Creating Opportunities, which tells stories of how individuals have brought about social change. Their previous book, Half the Sky, Turning Oppression into Opportunities for Women, calls attention to the oppression of women and girls in Asia and Africa. It was a national bestseller and also the topic of a PBS documentary that aired in 2012. Jason Riley is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a columnist and editorial board member at the Wall Street Journal, where he has worked for more than 20 years. He has written opinion pieces on politics, economics, education, immigration, and race, among many other topics. And for the past 10 years, Jason has also been a commentator for Fox News. His first book, Let Them In, The Case for Open Borders, argues for an immigration policy based on free market economic principles. His second book, Please Stop Helping Us, How Liberals Make It Harder for Blacks to Succeed, critically examines how government programs intended to help the black underclass, such as affirmative action and minimum wage laws, have had counterproductive results. Separately, these journalists have authored very provocative and thoughtful pieces on some of the most important issues of the day. Together, they are here tonight to delve into the issues of free speech and political correctness on college campuses. So I hope you will please all join me in welcoming Nicholas Kristof and Jason Riley. So I'm just going to jump right in with the election. Obviously, free speech and political correctness were important issues on college campuses before November 8th, but the election of Donald Trump has arguably made them more evident, more contentious. And so let me relate a specific anecdote that I saw here at Bowdoin. A few days after the election, the Bowdoin student government held a forum where over at our student union, and in many ways a very kind of traditional forum. There were microphones, people were expressing their thoughts and questions, but BSG also used anonymous polling software. So students could use their phones and other participants, and they could use their phones to text in anonymously their comments and questions, which were then displayed up on a screen. And so very, very quickly, the issue of political correctness came up. So one person wrote, "People are tired of political correctness." And shortly thereafter, another person wrote, "Can someone explain why political correctness is a bad thing?" So how do you respond to these comments? How would you define or characterize the issue of political correctness on college campuses? And how has the election perhaps redefined or changed these issues, if at all? So maybe, Jason, if you wanted to jump right in.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you for doing this and thank Bowdoin for for inviting me. I appreciate it. I think this is a very important topic. Political correctness, I think, is a term you need to define before you use it. Maybe I should start by saying what I don't think political correctness is. I mean, in the context of this election, I think Donald Trump and his defenders attempted to stretch the definition of the term beyond all recognition. As I define it, political correctness is not calling women pigs and going after the families of fallen soldiers, and that's crudeness, that's juvenile, that's wrong. That's not political incorrectness. For me, political incorrectness is someone who wants to talk about black incarceration rates but not black crime rates. Someone who wants to divorce religion from Islamic terrorism. That, as I have understood the term and have used the term, is political incorrect language. I don't think the type of language we saw coming out of Trump and some of his supporters should be considered political correctness. I think the English language is rich enough to come up with other terms for what he was saying.
Well, thanks for having us here, and thank you also for arranging this great snowfall. I was so impressed to get off the plane and be welcomed by these snowflakes. So much appreciated. I guess a couple of points about political correctness. There's obviously a sort of a fine line to be drawn, or a balance to be drawn. On the one hand, I think when we don't want to antagonize people, and on the other hand, one doesn't want to avoid raising serious questions about topics. There's some balance to be had there. I think it clearly is true that sometimes people walk on eggshells about issues involving race, ethnicity, religion, and there is some feeling that campuses are where this has been taken particularly far. On the one hand, this is about civility. On the other hand, it taken too far, it becomes avoiding meaningful conversations. And I do think that resentment at this was something that truly did empower Donald Trump. And I'm from rural Oregon, and one of our neighbors was very active in the Democratic Party. And this year he voted for Donald Trump, and he said the reason was that he thought political correctness had gone overboard. And I profoundly disagreed with that, but I think that that resentment is broadly shared. I guess I'd also say that one of my concerns, though, as a fallout from the Trump election, I say this as somebody who was aghast at the election and is fearful about what may happen over the next 4 years. But I do think that there is a problem that American universities tend to be particularly liberal places and often don't adequately expose students to conservative viewpoints. And I guess one of my concerns is that the election will accentuate that trend and will lead liberals like myself to further kind of retreat into our own enclaves and create, if you will, more hostile environments for those groups like evangelical Christians who may be less welcome in the space that we inhabit, our space. And I do think that if we pride ourselves in the progressive community about being inclusive, then we've got a problem there. And I think there is a risk that illiberalism can be led by liberals on campuses. And I think this it's important to be exposed to all kinds of viewpoints, and that I'm a great believer that better decisions and judgments come out of diversity. And I believe in embracing diversity of races, of ethnicities, of religions, and also of ideologies. And I think that those who tend to agree with me that we've sometimes neglected that issue of ideological diversity. And I fear that the Trump election may compound that in the next 4 years as each side becomes somewhat more polarized, more suspicious of the other, more convinced that the other side is not only wrong thinking, but also perhaps immoral to boot.
Do you agree with that potential kind of assessment of the impact of the election on college campuses?
Well, as you said earlier, this was an issue prior to Trump. I don't know to what extent his election will exacerbate things. Things have reached ridiculous heights, I think. As some of you might know, the University of Chicago now sends out a letter to incoming freshmen saying that we don't do safe spaces and trigger warnings and microaggressions at our school, so don't come here expecting us to adhere to those sorts of things. That they need to send out such a letter, I think, speaks volumes. University of Virginia, recently, the students and faculty were complaining that the president of the school sent out a letter to students quoting Thomas Jefferson. Now, I'm sure you all know that Thomas Jefferson founded the University of Virginia. So you don't know whether the hypocrisy is more ridiculous. Of course, the objection to Thomas Jefferson being quoted is that he was a slave owner. So the faculty has no problem taking a paycheck from a school founded by a slave owner. Students have no problem attending a school founded by a slave owner. So so long as no one ever mentions the man's name on campus. This is what it's gotten to, and Trump didn't start this. And again, I think it's a disservice to the English language to call Trump's behavior politically incorrect. It was way beyond that. I'm not someone who supported his campaign, and I don't know that behavior got him elected, which is why I don't think I'm as concerned as Nick is about where we're headed in terms of that. I think he was elected for other reasons, primarily. But this is an issue I think that we need to address independent of Donald Trump and his impact on our public conversations over the next 4 years.
Right, but certainly I agree that political incorrectness isn't necessarily the right term to describe his behavior, but certainly his presidency has led to many to express fear that his presidency will essentially give license to hateful rhetoric, undermine ongoing efforts to, at places like Bowdoin and elsewhere, these ongoing efforts to create more inclusive campus environments. So I think there's that kind of fear, right, that I think, Nick, you're sort of suggesting. So I agree, like, how do we actually have these conversations then to prevent that from happening? How can we have productive conversations about the election? How can we ensure that the election really does open up new chances for dialogue and that campus can remain and even become more strongly a place of both free expression but also a place of inclusion?
I mean, from my perspective, I'm less concerned about some of the things that happen on campuses and less concerned with the political correctness debates or the microaggressions issues or the trigger warnings. I mean, my sense is that they get a lot of attention in the national conversation, but that they don't really affect students' lives very much. I mean, when I ask students about trigger warnings, you know, I'm curious actually here, of those of you who are students, how many of you have ever had a trigger warning in a class? How many of you are students who have not had a trigger warning in a class? Yeah, I mean, that's kind of my sense, and that it's, that the debate about it, I mean, I don't really have a passionate view. If people might be traumatized by something, I think it's fine to warn them. But it seems to me that of the issues confronting the country, that's about issue 985th. And but I do think that there is a real issue of students encountering different perspectives, and that's why I'm more concerned about issues of faculty hiring and trying to believing that people should be exposed to conservative values as well as liberal values when they're on campus, and why there should be intellectual diversity. To me, that seems a much more kind of fundamental issue than the one about trigger warnings or safe spaces or whatever else it may be.
I agree that that there's a problem in terms of the ideological tilt of people who run our colleges today. It's been an issue for a while. There are some different schools of thought, at least among conservatives, on how that should be addressed. Maybe my view is, I'll tell a story. I was speaking to some years ago to a retired, well, not retired, he doesn't teach anymore, but a former professor of economics. Was teaching a class in Marxism many years ago. And at the end of the semester, some students came up to him and said, "Professor, we really enjoyed your class, but we still have no idea about what you personally think of Karl Marx." And he said that was the highest compliment they could have paid me. He said, "It was not my job to teach them what I personally think about Karl Marx." And the point he was getting at is that we don't need to counterbalance the liberalism in academia. We need to get academia to keep their politics out of the classroom. If you want to be exposed to different points of view, have forums like this, invite conservatives on campus to speak and expose kids to different points of view. The fear is that the kids are being indoctrinated, taught what to think instead of how to think. And that's the problem. And so there are some conservatives who say, no, we need to hire more conservative professors to counterbalance the liberal professors. I'm not sure that's the way to go. I'd rather we hire people to keep their politics out of the classroom.
There have been interesting surveys of conservative scholars about whether there should be affirmative action for conservative scholars, which creates some cognitive dissonance. But in general, to their credit, those conservative scholars, who are generally against affirmative action, also agree that, by and large, there should not be affirmative action for themselves.
It's also used by conservatives who otherwise would reject policies like tenure, but insist that as conservatives they need it on campus to avoid getting fired for speaking out. I don't buy that argument either, but it is used.
But Nick, you've in some ways, I think, perhaps might have a difference of opinion, because I think you've suggested that we actually do need to hire more conservative professors.
Yeah.
And Jason's saying something different about that. So
yeah, I mean, I really do believe that, especially in the social sciences, that universities would be healthier if they were more ideologically diverse. And in general, I defer to conservative scholars on this, and if they think affirmative action is the wrong approach, then I defer to them. But it's when I've written about this issue, liberal scholars have always made the argument about the pipeline, that you don't have conservatives in the pipeline, that they self-select out. They care about money, so they all go to Wall Street, this kind of thing. And I think there is a pipeline issue, but I think in other contexts, if we're looking at women scholars or underrepresented minority scholars, then universities know that they need to address the pipeline issue. They need to do more outreach. They need to try to figure out how they can be more hospitable. And I think that some of those same tools can be used. I mean, if I were a conservative undergraduate thinking about a PhD, I think I would be wary about pursuing a PhD in a field like sociology or anthropology that has a strong conservative, strong liberal orientation, for fear, how I spent years on my PhD, and are my dissertation readers going to be well disposed to it? I mean, there are no easy solutions here. There are no magic wands, and it's going to be hard to address these things. But I don't think it's impossible, and I think that a starting point is to make ourselves aware of the shortcoming, and to understand, to acknowledge that if we embrace diversity, then one kind of diversity we should embrace is thought diversity, intellectual diversity, ideological diversity.
So, if I can return to one of your comments, Jason, about keeping politics out of the classroom, and how is that achieved? I guess I think that there certainly would be ways in which any scholar has some sort of subjective perspective, just by virtue of choosing a particular text or choosing a particular topic to focus on. But I think that many of my colleagues and I would not necessarily think that is indoctrination. So I guess I'm wondering how to balance, achieving what your economics colleague achieved, right? That his students left the classroom not knowing what he thought about Marx, versus the fact that I think any syllabus has some. I think it's impossible to construct any syllabus without any sort of values or perspective placed in it.
Well, presumably they didn't know what he thought about Marx, and it was an observation they were able to make because there were Marxist economic professors on campus. And they didn't know if he was one of them or not. Right. I think it's you could start with taking on this trigger warning, safe space. You're revealing something right there by indulging that sort of thing in your classroom. Mm-hmm. So I think to make students comfortable from all ideological backgrounds, and when a kid is 18 or 19 years old, I don't even know if they have an ideological background yet. They're still forming it. But I don't think it's that difficult to start moving things in a different direction. The kids are getting a message from the faculty, from administrators, about what is acceptable and what is unacceptable, and the polling is pretty clear on this. How comfortable kids on campus feel speaking their mind, and there have been polls that show that seniors are less comfortable than freshmen because this is what they pick up on during their 4 years on campus. So I think there are ways to address it. Another way to address it is in who is welcome as a speaker on campus when outsiders are invited, and this is a huge issue nowadays. This epidemic of disinvitations. Mm-hmm. There's a group called Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, campus free speech group, started by liberals, ACLU types, have been tracking these disinvitation incidents since 2000. The database has over 300 names in it. I'm one of them now, actually. Earlier this year, I was disinvited to speak somewhere after initially being invited. And it's not necessarily just a conservative thing. This database is full of liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, Marxists. There's an intolerance on campus. The campuses were the birthplace of the free speech movement a half century ago. Today, they're better known for policing speech. And I think that's a very dangerous situation.
Yeah, I totally agree that the issue of disinviting people, and it's particularly conservatives have been disinvited, or people perceived as conservative, who've been disinvited, and I think that, that's students are the losers when that happens. And the right way to do it is to have people protest and have there be a discussion about it. But to disinvite, to end the discussion before it begins, I think is a real problem. I think I'd also say that I think Jason and I disagree about the how much of an issue safe spaces are, or either the whole kind of college political correctness. But I do think that he's right that it's a problem that people become nervous about talking about some of these issues. And actually, I think that race is an interesting example where, as a country, one of our problems is that whites are often nervous about talking about racial issues, and you can't, it seems to me that, this is something that African Americans think about a lot. It's something that whites, it's often uncomfortable to think about. And from my point of view, you can't get very far talking about a lot of social justice issues unless you begin to have a pretty blunt conversation about race. And I think it's unhealthy for the country if people are, if whites are intimidated about talking about some of these issues and raising them, and so from a different perspective, I come to the same conclusion.
No, you're absolutely right in that observation. Blacks generally are much more comfortable talking about racial issues. I mean, just turn on black radio or black television shows. It is a constant subject, and it's very openly addressed. And that's that becomes a problem when in interracial formats. I spent, I think it was last year, did a handful of debates with a professor on affirmative action at a bunch of different schools. All of them were at Wellesley and UCLA and some other places. And we'd usually have a mixed race audience, depending on the school. And we would do our debate, and then we'd do a Q&A. The only people who would engage typically were minorities in the audience and the liberals in the audience. And after each debate, a small clutch of people would come up to me and almost whisper, "Thank you for coming. We're sorry we didn't participate in the Q&A, but you get to leave. We have to live with these people for the next 4 years." I mean, they were so cowed into silence, they would not even engage in the debate. And I found that chilling. But it's happened again and again and again. These kids feel intimidated into silence through the environment. And I place the emphasis really on the adults running the campus that have allowed such a hostile environment for people who hold different perspectives. But it does filter down, and express itself in these ways.
You know, my wife is Chinese American, and when we first met, we were set up by a mutual friend who we were going to be meeting at a party, and the mutual friend. So I asked, so what is Cheryl like? And the friend said, oh, she's she's your age. She just graduated from business school. She's working at the Wall Street Journal. She's gorgeous. She's nice. She does this. She does that. But didn't want to mention one of the more obvious things about her, which is that she is Chinese American, and didn't want to touch on it, I think, because it felt like, race is something people are uncomfortable about it. And so when I met Cheryl at the party, and it just seemed sort of an odd thing to leave out, and I think it reflects this sort of discomfort.
This is a white person?
This is a white white woman. And,
I've had similar experiences. I remember being in a newsroom once, and someone trying to point out someone across the room to me. And the easiest thing to say, the black guy over there. But they were describing the clothes. A black person would never have gone through that. They would have just said, see that black guy over there? Go talk to him. He'll tell you what you need. But it really manifests itself in these ways.
Well, you're both relating instances that were off college campuses, so I'm wondering if we can, think about the college campus environment. And Jason, you suggested that part of the problems are the administrators, but I'm wondering if there are other factors that help to explain why these issues, debates about political correctness, free speech, have been particularly distinct on college campuses. Are there other factors? Like immediately something that comes to mind would be the imperative of academic freedom as being a critical component of why these debates are somewhat distinct or different than they are outside of college campuses. But maybe there are other factors that come to mind when you think about why these debates have unfolded in a particular way on college campuses.
I mean, I guess one of my concerns, I'm deeply concerned with issues of economic or social justice, and I guess I sometimes see in whatever community we are that elites tend to be absorbed with their own kinds of problems rather than with what seem to me the most urgent problems. And so on campuses, people will raise issues about history, for example. And I think there was an issue here, Jefferson Davis scholarship or something. So, and at Yale, obviously, so those issues have come up at many campuses, at Harvard Law School, and if people can be made to feel more included, I don't really have a strong view about that, but it does seem to me that often, meanwhile, there are 535,000 kids around the country who have lead poisoning. Almost a quarter of kids in the U.S. are living below the poverty line. There are, vast, 1 in 20 American kids is living below less than $2 per person per day, the international standard of poverty. They'd be poor if they lived in Ethiopia and they're in the U.S. And or issues of gender, which is something near and dear to my heart, that many of the conversations on campuses or among elites are about equal pay or board representation. And those are absolutely legitimate conversations to have. Those are worthy issues. But at the same time, it seems to me that some of the most important gender issues are ones like domestic violence. 3 women a day killed in the U.S. by their domestic partners. Human trafficking. 10,000 underage girls a year, 17 and under, trafficked into the sex trade in the U.S. each year. And that because we tend to, frankly, be kind of fortunate and live in fortunate communities and be blessed with lucky problems to have, that we sometimes are distracted by these kinds of problems rather than what seem to me the most urgent ones of homelessness and violence, poverty, and so on.
I think there's also some tradition here in the U.S., particularly since the 60s. There's a sense that this is what you're supposed to do at college. You're supposed to go off and act out. You're supposed to come up with something to protest. College is where you're supposed to be protesting something. You're not being a responsible student if you're not angry about something and protest. And that's a mentality that I think came out of the 1960s. But that's also a template here. I mean, we've been here in the late 60s, in the early 70s. The war protesters, you had the Black Power movement, you had armed students taking over administrative buildings. We've been here. For me, the X factor is how the adults on campus respond to this, and I really do fault the adults today on campus, particularly since many of them are the ones who brought us the free speech movement in the 60s. They're now in charge, and the idea that they would be pushing the policing of speech and so forth, and just this. Another example, I believe it was Hampshire College or University in Massachusetts that stopped waving the American flag recently. The president of the school issued a statement that said, well, some members of our community see it as a symbol of fear and intimidation, so we're not going to wave it anymore on campus. I mean, what country is this again? This is the president of the school. He's setting the tone here. Kids find out they can get the president of the school to take down the American flag. Wow. Let's see what else we can do. I mean, that's why I think it does fall back to the adults and how they are handling this and responding to it. And you see some different reactions at different schools. Even throughout the recent months of the Black Lives Matter protesters and so forth, that was handled differently on different campuses with different results.
So I think there's time for one final question. So this is my sort of cue to those of you who might be interested in asking questions to sort of get ready for that. And I'll sort of launch into my last question, at least for this part of our discussion. So I'm curious then, so Nick, I'm sort of responding to what you said about in some ways college students get sort of kind of burrow into issues that are specific to their lives, that they lose sight of these bigger issues. But that being said, they do spend 4 years very deeply burrowed into these communities. And I think at a small liberal arts college like Bowdoin and elsewhere, that's particularly the case. So I'm wondering what you both think about the role of a small private liberal arts college in these debates about political correctness and free speech. In other words, how do you think these smaller environments, perhaps it's more difficult, or maybe they have a higher standard of accountability because it's such a small campus and people do know each other, there's less of an opportunity to sort of be anonymous, So I'm curious about the issue of scale, right? We're not talking about a large research university, we're talking about a liberal arts college and how that might affect the ways in which we engage as well as how we address these issues.
Well, I mean, I do think that one of the most important things about any education is to expose students to things that are new and different and challenging, to get them out of their comfort zone. And that's the reason we have study abroad programs. It's a reason we have classes about topics that are going to, stretch them and challenge them. But I do think, and it's a reason we try to create more diverse student bodies and more diverse faculties. There's, there's good survey data on American attitudes toward Muslims, and Americans who don't have a Muslim friend, who don't know a Muslim, have very negative views about Muslims. those Americans who do actually know a Muslim are, accept them as everybody else. And so I think that, those are the reasons we try to create more diverse environments, that we try to expose students to different things. And I think we can, take that further in the diversity point of view by trying to expose people to other points of view, which is more likely to mean more conservative points of view in social sciences, but also to get people off campuses. One of the things that was striking was the degree to which liberals were not really engaged with white working class communities. And Maine obviously has parts of the state that have been economically left behind. I don't know if there are ways of having student experiences that would give students some encounters in communities that have been kind of left behind, very working class, a very different environment. That might be as much of a study abroad experience as Florence would for some students. I'm kind of thinking out loud, but but I do think that to the extent one can challenge students and expose them to circles and environments that they have not been exposed to and that are sometimes uncomfortable, that is a really important, useful thing.
I would agree with a lot of that. I don't know that the size of the school, whether it's a liberal arts school, big research university, I don't know if that affects what I think the mission of the school should be in this respect, which is to get kids out of their comfort zone, allow them to develop their critical thinking skills, argue with people, debate people, learn that saying I'm offended shouldn't end an argument. Learn the difference between a slogan and an argument. Learn how to analyze an issue from different points of view. Because I don't think you're doing the kids any favors by letting them exist in this bubble. You're teaching kids to only talk to people they agree with, which is not going to do them any favors or help them develop those critical thinking skills. And it's also not the real world. Those Donald Trump tweets are coming unfiltered when you leave campus. You better be able to take them. There will be no trigger warnings there. And I think in terms of preparing students for the real world, that's what's necessary. I don't think coddling students is doing them any favors or teaching them to be offended instead of teaching them to defend themselves rhetorically or defend themselves through out-arguing the other person. That should be what the college experience is about. And I think we've gotten away from that.
Thank you both. So I think we can move to questions and answers now. So if I'll allow some people to start lining up.
Looks like nobody wants to ask a question.
Oh, goodness. Well, that's great. Awesome. So I'm just going to alternate back and forth. So why don't we start over here?
Hi, thank you both so much for coming. My question's about, so you're talking about factors for political correctness on campus and how administrators or faculty can affect that. And I was wondering what you both think about the necessity to appear inclusive to the outside community, outside of the school, and the role of social media in that when an event might happen on campus, the social media community is often quick to judge or talk about what's happening, and I was wondering how you think that and then the outward appearance of a school can either help or hinder discussion on campus. Does that question make sense?
Well, I can talk about the outward appearance, meaning who's admitted to the school. Does that reflect?
Yeah, or like how the rest of the nation maybe perceives Bowdoin as an inclusive community or something like that.
Well, I don't know if that should rank at the top of Bowden's mission. I don't know if that's what families are paying all this money for. They're paying for a decent, well-rounded liberal arts education. And I think Bowdoin is admitting a student body that it thinks will help it pursue that goal. And I think that should be at the top of its list of priorities. I don't think the school should be indifferent to what's going on. It should be a good corporate citizen or what have you, or not corporate, but I guess a nonprofit citizen in this case. But so it shouldn't be indifferent to that. But I don't know that should be at the top of its list of concerns.
Yeah, I guess I pretty much agree. I mean, if the concern is kind of embarrassing Bowdoin with social media posts, I guess on behalf of the administration, I just say don't embarrass the college. But I guess that doesn't. I think there are a lot of other issues that I guess would worry me more.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Over here. You guys are camped out over here.
Thank you both for coming tonight. Bowdoin seeks to foster an inclusive, tolerant learning community. Under that banner, what do you think that should look like? And can students ever be punished for non-threatening speech or symbolic gestures?
In general, I think that non-threatening, inquisitive speech, should not be punished. I'm trying to think of some example where, but in general, I think one should encourage dialogue and conversation, and one also wants to encourage civility, and it's easy to, in my home area in Oregon, the other Portland, this year with Trump kind of galvanized there's a lot of tension between the white community and the Latino community, and Trump galvanized some of the white community who felt that somebody is listening to them, and so in the local high school there were white students who were chanting things like "Build a Wall" and hung a banner calling "Build a Wall" in ways that were clearly intended to humiliate and discomfort the Latino students, and that's not a conversation, that's bullying. But I think that where there is genuine conversation or even advocacy on a campus, then one should both try to promote civility, but also try to promote real vigorous exchanges that at times are going to be uncomfortable for people.
We can move on.
You don't?
Yeah.
Are you sure?
That's
Okay,
fine, yeah.
all right. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so part of my question you just answered, so I'll rephrase it a little bit. Jonathan Haidt goes through colleges, and he looks at colleges and this specific issue in the terms of moral psychology, and he advocates for a schism. He's saying that colleges can't be both. You should, in your mission statement, you should say either we pursue a truth with debate, which he quotes John Stuart Mill, or he says we should advocate to change the world, which he quotes Marx, and he says essentially that has trickled down into social justice, and a college should define that and say students choose, but it can't be a facade. So I would be curious in what your view is in that.
Go ahead.
I really admire Jonathan Haidt, and I recommend his website, Heterodox Academy, but I don't really buy that argument, and I haven't thought about it as much in a university context, but in a journalism context, I think newspapers should be in the business of truth, seeking truth from facts, as Deng Xiaoping used to say. And yet I also think that, one reason that I entered journalism was because I thought that it was socially relevant and socially important and had some levers through which one could create a better world. And there's absolutely a tension between those two. And if you have every reporter covering every city council meeting trying to create a better world, then you have chaos. But you can, I think, both value truth and honor that principle and honor some kind of larger social purpose for a university, recognizing that at times there will be conflicts, at times there will be incommensurate, and yet still have more than one principle one is trying to maximize.
Good evening. In speaking on the reluctance of whites to talk about race versus minorities, you both shared an anecdote from your lives. So Jason, you talked about seeing a black man across the room and how someone was hesitating to say that, whereas Kristof, sorry, you talked about meeting your wife Cheryl for the first time and how someone didn't mention that she was Chinese American. And personally, you equated the two scenarios, but I actually don't agree. I think that the two are very different, and I think that in your case, there is an assumption that whiteness is the norm inherent in that situation. So I'd like for you two to comment on that.
I don't think my anecdote reflects what that
No,
whiteness being the
I'm saying
norm.
that your anecdote does not.
Oh,
but
okay.
Yours does.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. I was making just a broader point of the comfort level of blacks in particular to openly discuss race. It is not as taboo as it seems to be among some other groups. Among blacks, it just is not. And we were just making that general observation. At least that was my point.
Likewise, I think the point is this: there's this discomfort among whites in talking about race in almost any context, and that impairs a discussion of so many really important social issues in this country, and not just a discomfort with race, but a discomfort with a lot of sensitive issues, with religion, and that this is on the one hand, one wants to avoid offending people. On the other hand, we have to have some of these conversations.
I guess what I was saying is that in your case, if Cheryl had turned out to be white, the person would not say that Cheryl was white. So I find it weird in my viewpoint that you would mention that someone's Chinese American, but not mention that they were white. There seems to be an assumption there.
Well, there is an assumption, but I don't know that there's anything nefarious about it. Interracial relationships are still a minority of relationships. So sometimes people do double takes, where they make assumptions that your mate is of the same race as you. I don't think that there's anything underhanded going on there necessarily.
On Wednesday, I'm leaving for Madagascar, and if I'm asked on Thursday, which my photographer is, I'll say the white guy over there. And when I lived in China, where everybody else is Chinese, then there's a comfort level with talking about other races in other cultures in a way that the U.S. is apprehensive about, I think.
Thank you.
Let's move on over here.
Hi. I was wondering if you could explain what conservatism means, because from some conservative students I've spoken to, some of them would say that like they're economically conservative but like socially liberal, and like the two are so interconnected. I don't know, like I don't understand how it could be different. And then, like, what exactly are conservative students afraid of? Like, what do you think they're afraid of? Because I could really only think of like public shame.
And you need more than that.
No, I just mean like at college.
They shouldn't be concerned about being shamed on campus? I mean, you're saying that's a non-concern?
No, I'm not saying it's a non-concern, but more like when I think about like in these conversations, and like at least for them to feel like they can't engage in conversation, they can't speak up. Like for me, when I'm engaging in this type of conversation, I'm thinking about, oh, what, like, is my little brother safe at home? Like, is somebody going to shoot him when he goes to play basketball with his friends? Versus someone who's just thinking about, oh, somebody's going to like say I'm a racist.
So you're saying it's a non-issue for you to be shamed on campus, where you're spending the next 4 years of your life. They shouldn't worry about that.
I don't know.
Because it's not life-threatening?
I don't know.
Well, in terms of the definition of conservatism, I think you're going to get as many definitions as conservatives you ask, and people will. When someone says I'm an economic conservative, they're generally talking about taxes and fiscal issues, the size of government, the role of government. When they talk about social conservatism, it has to do often with issues like gay marriage or abortion. And so there are people who are for gay marriage but want lower taxes. And they would describe themselves as a fiscal conservative and a social liberal.
I would add that, I mean, I think in liberal communities that we have some respect for economic conservatives. We tend to be much more suspicious of social conservatives, and that we tend to be less exposed to social conservatives. Gun attitudes toward guns are kind of a classic issue of social conservatives, and that it's a lot easier to find people who would adopt conservative positions on taxes, whereas people who believe in open carry laws are probably fewer among university professors or fewer among liberal columnists, for example. And I think that it's, many of these issues are, I've talked about universities, but many of them are exactly the same issues in universities, in newspapers, in journalism. And we have economic conservatives who are columnists and so on. We have many fewer who are social conservatives. And I think, and evangelical Christians are particularly underrepresented. 26% of the electorate, if I remember right, is evangelical conservative, and one tends not to hear those perspectives very much, and I think it, for reasons of intellectual curiosity, of understanding the world and the country, it would be useful if we heard more of those voices on campuses and also in the news media.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. So we've talked about how we need to improve public discourse on campuses. My question is, do you think this can be done administratively from the top down, or do you think it has to start with the students? And maybe that should happen in the admissions process, or perhaps we should just rely on events like this to get us to engage with other ideas. But I guess the thrust of my question is, where does this start, from the students or from the administration?
I think it starts with the administration. I think they set the tone on campus. And when you say, okay, the flag bothers some people, take down the American flag, you've set a tone on campus. I think it starts there. And I think students will get the message very quickly if the adults behave like adults on campus. And I think we see, when the University of Chicago sends out a letter saying don't bring any trigger warning, safe space stuff here, they've set a tone.
The way I see it, that's kind of those are issues that matter in the classroom, like the microaggressions thing and the trigger warnings, but at least with the experience I've had, a lot of my kind of moments of enlightenment have been outside the classroom. To me, that has to do with the makeup of the student body and not anything the administration can do. So what would you say to that?
I mean, I don't think that there is so much of an issue of admissions offices who are selecting liberal students over conservative students. At least if there is, I don't see any signs of that. I mean, I suppose there is a general kind of enthusiasm for students who are socially conscious and starting 5 different organizations in high school to change the world, and it may be that the world changers are disproportionately liberal. I'm not sure. But I guess I would say that where I think students, I think work should begin at every possible end, and where I think that all of us, whether we are students or faculty or adults in the community, can try to address this is trying to open ourselves to information sources that we deeply disagree with. And one of the misfortunes of modern technology is that it is now very easy to self-select an information source that will reliably confirm your every prejudice about the world. And I think that's really unfortunate for society. I think it's unfortunate for individuals. And so if you, so every, so on Twitter and Facebook, I follow various conservatives, and every day I read the Wall Street Journal editorial page, and I think of it as every day I go for a run, and it's sometimes painful, but it builds a better me. And likewise, when I read, I disagree a lot with the stuff I read when I'm following conservatives, but I do think that in the same way that running likewise leaves me sweaty and disheveled, that it also makes a better me.
I would agree with that. We were talking about that earlier tonight over dinner. Trying to expose yourself to people and news outlets that you disagree with, I think, is very constructive, and we're seeing less and less of it. And it's not just anecdotal. There have been a number of studies on this, that people tend to tune into what they want to hear. And that's, I think, a disturbing trend.
Thanks.
Over here.
Hi. Can you hear me? Okay. I think it's important that we be skeptical about the phrase political correctness, and I think that you both would agree. I wonder if you could address how it's really possible, if it's possible, to separate the political from the moral. And I think the symbol of the American flag is actually pretty useful when we're considering this problem. If students at Hampshire College decided that they didn't want the American flag to wave on their campus, is that because, is protest a childish, is that really just acting out, as Mr. Riley said, or is that because the flag actually stands for moral values that we might be able to separate just from this strict binary of conservative and liberal?
I think that, again, my use of that example has to do with what the adults on campus are tolerating and the tone it sets. Whether it's quoting Thomas Jefferson at the University of Virginia or waving the flag on an American campus. I think the adults, it is left to the adults to draw a line as to what they will indulge and what they will not indulge. And I don't think it's irrational to draw a line at the U.S. flag is going to fly on this campus.
I guess I would say that if students want to protest the flag, want to protest a letter quoting Thomas Jefferson, I don't really have strong feelings about it, but I do think that that those are kind of symbolic things, and that one of the problems with university liberalism is that it has very much embraced symbolism. And at a time when there are such incredible, enormous needs across the country, I do think that the rush to find offense at symbols and the obsession with symbolism is a missed opportunity to address kids who are being left behind, probably within, a few miles of Hampshire College or University of Virginia or wherever else. And I wish that we could become as passionate and as engaged about some of those needs as we do about these various symbols.
I have to interrupt, sorry, because I go to Hampshire, so I read the president's statement, and the flag was lowered to half-staff. That was one symbol. Someone burned it. That was another symbol. The president said we're going to take all flags down to create discussion. There was a huge protest at the end of the driveway where more flags were raised. The flag has now been re-raised after a sort of a week of discussion. So it's not quite binary black and white.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one final question, so from over here, please.
Hello. It's a pleasure getting to talk to you guys. Thank you for coming. And so I want to bring up a point that's a little different than what we've been talking about, but you mentioned it, and it's the sort of rise of illiberalism that has kind of been an international phenomenon between Turkey, Hungary, the UK, and some would argue the US as well. And while it is a distinctly different conversation politically than a conservative versus liberal discussion, the liberal and illiberalism debate is one that's not oft talked about but has a similar tenor and rhetoric to it. And my question is, why is it that it is talked about less frequently on campus, given that college campuses tend to be a microcosm of the US government or US society in a smaller setting?
Oh, but they're not. They're nowhere close to a microcosm of US society. That's part of the problem, is how out of touch academia is from the rest of the country. Look at a map of who voted for whom in academic towns and cities. It is vastly different from the way the country voted. Look at the voting preferences of college professors versus people in other professions. No, I think your premise is somewhat problematic.
I mean, I would add that, Trump to me represents the sort of most alarming kind of illiberalism, and I think has an authoritarian streak. And I've met a lot of politicians in my career as a journalist. I have never met a national politician so ill-informed, so evasive, frankly, so puerile on some issues. I think he's a real problem. But that's one kind of illiberalism nationally. I think that the illiberalism on campuses is a very different kind, and it tends to enforce, things like conservative speakers or points of view that are dissonant. And while I think that there are, lots of Muslims around the country, or lots of Latino students, or lots of people of color who may be nervous in a Trump administration, on a lot of liberal campuses, it would be a conservative evangelical Trump voter who would be feeling nervous. And I think, so it bothers me when in these bastions that represent my values that I deeply believe in, like universities, to see a very different strain of illiberalism being led by my fellow liberals.
So we won't be able to have any further questions, but I do want to, before we thank our guests, I want to remind you that if you do have tickets for the dessert reception, to make your way to Thorne for dessert and further discussion. But now I'd actually really like to take a moment to thank our guests this evening, Nicholas Kristof and Jason.
Thanks a lot.